Pod koniec października 2025 roku odbywały się we Wrocławiu w ramach Festiwalu Kultury Protestanckiej Dni Bonhoefferowskie. Wybrani uczniowie naszej szkoły uczestniczyli w wykładach i wydarzeniach poświęconych temu protestanckiemu duchownemu i zdecydowanemu przeciwnikowi nazizmu. Koło dziennikarskie przeprowadziło szereg wywiadów poświęconych postaci Dietricha Bonhoeffera. Zapraszamy do wysłuchania rozmowy z doktorem Joelem Burnellem z Ewangelikalnej Wyższej Szkoły Teologicznej we Wrocławiu oraz z księdzem profesorem Bogdanem Ferdkiem z Papieskiego Wydziału Teologicznego we Wrocławiu.
We are extremely grateful that you have found time to talk to us about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a very significant figure in the history of our city. When we visit London, we can discover that above the main door of Westminster Abbey is a monument of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But we also know that he had a deep connection with Breslau, nowadays Wrocław. He spent the first years in the city before his family finally moved to Berlin. Could you tell us a bit more about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life? Did he ever came back to his home city?
He was here occasionally, not very often. His grandparents on his mother's side lived here, and so they would visit. And they were small. They would take a 15-minute walk to the grandparents' house. The family also had, very interesting, they had a house up in the mountains in the south, in Sudety Mountains, where they would go. And his love for nature, I think, was also awakened then. He fell in love with the country here, and then when they moved to Berlin, they had another place, in the middle of Germany. It had a big influence on his life, I think, his time with his family here, growing up. And of course, it was a different life in Berlin. This is a really important school, university here, and hospital where his father worked. But Berlin, they were right in the center of the academic and political, social life of Germany. But the time here was, I think, very important to him, very foundational to his life further.
Could you tell us what the attitude of Dietrich Bonhoeffer on the persecution of the Jewish nation was?
He was one of the very first to speak out in 1933 against the treatment of the Jews. One was to defend the right of the Lutheran Church to have, of course, converted Jews serving as pastors in church offices. And he wrote several other articles and spoke publicly against the racist policies. Very quickly, his family was one of the first to realize where the Third Reich was going. And then, of course, with his involvement with their family connections, and then we got into the resistance movement after the war started. They had inside information, contacts with the Abwehr, the military police, and others. They were documenting the war crimes that were taking place. And the question is, what do you do about that? Well, he spoke about it in the church. He called on the church to take a stand, international church, the German church. Some did, but not as a whole. And so he was forced. Yes, he would have worked in the church, in the community, and the university. But when those doors were closed to him, he couldn't speak in public. He couldn't publish in Germany. He got involved in the conspiracy to overthrow Hitler, to kill Hitler, to stop the war, to call an armistice, and bring the killing to a stop. So he took a very strong stand from the first. Again, one of the very first to see where the murderous policies, racist policies and the war policies of the Third Reich were going. And from the beginning was an outspoken critic and worked in many ways to every way he could think of to oppose it.
Dr. Burnell, you told us a lot about Dietrich being a total opponent to anti-Semitism. He was also anti-Nazi dissident and planned on killing Hitler. He was involved with a whole conspiracy. However, Christian theology claims that homicide is one of the greatest sins. And how could a Lutheran pastor think of killing a man even as evil as Hitler? I think it's a sort of paradox.
Well, it's a very good question. And it's asked many times. Many people think, how could he do this? He was a pacifist. But his ethic is his very interesting ethic. His ethic is an ethic of responsibility, freedom, is an ethic of, as a Christian, obedience to Christ. But that doesn't mean to just a set of external rules. It means just, what is God doing right now in the world? What is God calling us to do? What's God calling me to do? And so I have to find that. And so this isn't an ethic of rules where you have a certain number of laws, rules, principles. All you have to do to know what's right is to know which law applies to this context. That's a causalistic ethic where the rules, it's a deontological ethic where the rules tell you what to do. He says that's not even morality. That's just obedience out of fear for God or fear for whatever. So his ethic was one of responsibility. He says, in this world, there's always conflicts. Even God's rules sometimes seem contradictory. How do you do this and that at the same time? How can you even follow all the 10 commandments at the same time? Sometimes we're in a situation where it isn't clear. Most things are obvious. Just being a decent human being every day. Most of those things are pretty obvious, but there's situations that it isn't clear, and we have to make a choice. And he, as a Lutheran, said he followed what he felt was like he said early on. He says, if my job as a pastor, as a Christian, is just to pray for the dead and comfort the wounded, the ones who lost their loved ones, but if I can actually stop the killing. And so he laid that foundation out as a pacifist in 1933, which led to his involvement in the conspiracy to kill Hitler and end the war, and which also then ended up leading to his death. So his ethic is one. It's more than a situational ethic. It isn't just, but you only recognize what God's will is for you, what it means to follow Christ, to embody Christ in this world, in a sense, in the actual situation when you get there. And there isn't any absolute certainty you're right. You do the best thing you learn, you study, you evaluate all the options, and then you make a decision. And a free decision, a responsible decision. And there's no guarantee it works. Their plan to kill Hitler failed. But he didn't regret that. He said, I would do it again. That was what and so a lot depends on how you look at that. There's some pacifism is absolute. You can't use violence in any, you can't protect your own life or the life of somebody's attacking your family. You can't attack or kill the attacker. You have, that's an ethic of rules. His ethic was one of solidarity with the people, an ethic of following Christ. What does that mean in the particular context? And sometimes that means that I have to maybe even kill somebody. He never made a rule out of that either. Okay, how bad does it have to be before you can use violence? Okay, because that's another ethic. That's another rule ethic. His ethic is one of discerning in the context what my freedom and responsibility is here. In his case, as a Christian, as a disciple of Christ, what does it mean? What should I do right here and now? And ultimately, that's up to God to judge me. He knows my heart. So we take that responsibility and act on it.
Thank you for saying that, because I think the key is to understand his ethics and theology to understand why he made this decision.
Yeah.
We also know that he wrote many theological works, and I assume that many of them might be a bit difficult for people to understand, for people who are not familiar with theology. So which of his writings would you recommend for beginners?
The easiest way to start reading Bonhoeffer is a very short book called Life Together. He wrote this. Basically, he was describing his work within the underground seminary, training Lutheran pastors, and also the almost religious order, the group of close compatriots and fellows that he created to help him in that task. And it's a short book. People told him while he was leading the school, he says, write about this. He says, it isn't time yet. When the Gestapo came and closed it in 1938, he went and he, in 6 weeks, he wrote this book describing what they did. And it's a classic. I had a friend who I think he's a Methodist, and he's a religious professor, president of religion in America. He would go every year to a Trappist monastery for just a time apart to meditate and to pray. And so he calls him in, and the head of the monastery comes over and he says, well, okay, I see you're here. What are you here for? I see that you're a Bonhoeffer scholar. Oh, yes. Would you give us a lecture on Bonhoeffer? And I says, well, why? Well, we're fascinated by his book Life Together. He says, but you've got Merton. I mean, you're the greatest at this. And he says, yes, but we can't understand how this Protestant theologian from Germany understood the spiritual life so well and the life in community so well. So that's a great place to start. I love his ethics, so that's a challenging work. Discipleship is great. The first chapter talks about cheap grace and costly grace. That's classic, easy. I got lost as a young student in the 5th chapter. It was a different world for me. I wasn't raised in a Lutheran church, and so the theology, it took me a while. Now I love it. Okay, his letters from prison are absolute classics. You get a picture of the man and in his context, and so it really from there it depends what you're interested in. Somebody says if you had to be on a desert island with 2 books, what would you take? I take the Bible and Bonhoeffer's ethics. But that's me. Somebody else might prefer his letters he wrote to his fiancée and back and forth, called Letters from So Many Too. Incredible, beautiful picture of the man. Those letters were secret for many years. She didn't allow them to be published until after she died. And so Ferdek he was a very old man. He got those letters and wrote it forward. He says, "This is amazing to me. I have a whole other picture of my best friend that came up in his letters to his fiancée. Very powerful testimony there too of a human being." And the way that he was navigating that horrible thing of being in a Nazi prison, facing death when he's engaged to this wonderful woman. So, but I want to start with life together.
You mentioned his fiancée. I personally didn't know that he had one.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about how they met, how their love story took part in those awful years of war and Nazism?
Yeah, I think Bonhoeffer, he wrote one time that there was 1 or 2 women that he knew. He says there was one friend he had. They didn't realize until it was too late that they should have been together. That time had passed. They'd gone on with their careers and maybe they met as students or whatever. But I think he felt like the times were so hard. He was so committed to his work and his calling as a professor and then in the resistance to Hitler and the Third Reich that he felt like he didn't have time or the energy for that. I think it was, in a sense, it was love, but it was also an act of courage, an act of saying, I'm going to stand for life. I'm not going to agree to this death. I may not survive this, but I'm going to live. I'm going to live. I'm going to take the risk to love. His fiancée was quite a bit younger. Met her first time. She was the daughter of really good friends of the family from a very rich family in Western Pomerania, Pomorzia. And so when he would go visit them, then she met. And then later on, when she became older, they sort of had to convince the grandmother that that she was old enough and this was a wise thing, but so they got engaged. They had a couple of months not even being together very much before he was arrested, and then their correspondence was carried on that way. So it's a tragic love story, but a beautiful story, and you get a lot better picture of who he was as a human being through that too. She was brilliant. She was young. She had wonderful ideas. You can see, I mean, he's highly educated, well along the road, quite a bit older, but she would have been a great partner for him, not just as the love of his life, but as intellectual dialogue partner in literature and thought, asked the same kinds of questions, different, but she was an incredible woman who would have been a great partner. So he chose well, they chose well. Times didn't allow them to be together.
When was the first time you had discovered the thought and theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
Oh, I'd heard about Bonhoeffer some, but he wasn't really talked about much in my church growing up, Baptist church in America. I'd heard about him. The most popular book then in the States was Discipleship Nachfolge. So I got a copy of that when I was in college. I started to read it. And again, I loved the opening. It made sense to me. And then it got into the way that he read Scripture, the Bible. The first part of this book is a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. He read that as a German Lutheran, and they have their own categories of theology that were different than the ones I grew up with. And without that knowledge, I got lost. I was a college student in chemical engineering, and I'm trying to read this German theologian, and it's just like, what is he trying to say? It wasn't until later on I found four volumes of his early translation of his work in English at a garage sale. And I bought them for like peanuts, for like $2 or something. I got these 4 books, began to read them. When I was, after I had been working here in Poland for a few years, working with, as a Protestant, working with the Oasis movement in the Catholic Church, working on the college campus here during communism. Went back to seminary, and I began to write my master's thesis. And I chose the topic of sanctification, of spiritual growth in community, not in the I come from a very individualistic culture. Even in America, Oregon, the West Coast, we're like the most individualistic people in the whole world. I had a conviction that to be a follower of Christ means you're part of the body of Christ, the fellowship of the saints, as Bonhoeffer wrote his thesis on. But I didn't know much about that. So when I was writing my thesis, besides looking at other books and at scripture, I read Life Together. And I wish my supervisor then would have asked me to read Sanctorum Communium, his doctoral thesis. That would take him even deeper. But then when I was back in Poland here teaching theology here at the school, I needed to pick a topic for my PhD thesis. And I started to write on Polish messianism, this crazy idea that Poland is the Christ of the nations. Well, it's a political theology. Okay, I'm not saying that the Christology wasn't sincere, but it was instrumental. It was how does this help us remain Polish and become free again? It's an early form of liberation theology. I read all the philosophers and the activists, but I loved the poetry. So Mickiewicz, and I read all of that, and everybody that followed them. There's beautiful in Polish messianism. There's all the best and the worst of Polish culture. Everything good and bad about Poland was already there, and you can make of it what you want. It's a myth. It's a story. It's a narration we tell. I have my own way of telling that story. It's very important to me. I identify with that story very much. Poland's my home, my home by choice. My wife is Polish. I've lived here for 40 years. This is my home now. And I love it. So I'm looking for a theological partner to critique or to dialogue with Mickiewicz and Polish messianism and the struggle of Poland. I went through solidarity and all that as well. And I want to go with Moltmann, who write about the theology of the cross and suffering, and that was a good theme, but there wasn't anything specific about that related to the Polish situation. Bonhoeffer, even though he was German Lutheran and not Polish Catholic, a different time, but he was writing about the same kinds of issues. What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a patriot, a citizen, a human being? How can I resist evil and yet not lose my humanity? And these are the same kinds of questions, of course, that the Poles were asking for centuries. And it helped me. That was a very helpful tool to critique messianism. Along the way, I discovered how important Bonhoeffer was for the Polish intellectuals, the activists of solidarity in the 70s and 80s and beyond. That I thought, I'll do a little chapter on the 3 or 4 people who mentioned Bonhoeffer. Well, it turns out it was everywhere. I've never seen in libraries and going through volumes of all these journals that were published. They wrote on that, and of course it was all in pseudonyms, and they thought, who they really are, the real names, it isn't Himbeski, it's Bogucka, it isn't Dindowski, it's Franczak, and so forth. It isn't Gajek, it's Jacek Kudon. And all these things, discovering all these stories and reading about it, it was a great discovery for me, and it's opened up so many ways of communicating and interacting and speaking to and learning from the Polish culture. It was a great personal joy for me, and opened up so many doors and so many friendships in Poland and beyond. So that's my story with Bonhoeffer. When I was at this first Bonhoeffer Congress in 2004. There was this elderly, semi-retired German pastor, and he said to me, "Joe, how long have you been reading Bonhoeffer?" I says, "Well, seriously, about 3 years." He says, He says, "You're a new convert." And then so I saw him again 4 years later. I had my thesis, I'd read on my doctorate. He says, now you've been through confirmation. That really takes a while to be accepted into the club. But one thing about the Bonhoeffer Society, I remember the International Bonhoeffer Society as well in the English section, but we meet from all over the world. And you go to like a BART Congress or a Ronner Congress, and everybody is very academic and they're serious, but it's like, these are serious topics. be very serious about our theology and our practice there. But half the people there are scholars, half of them are pastors, half of them are activists, half of them are just fans of Bonhoeffer. And everybody's welcome, everybody's respected as one of us. And so it's a really almost kind of a family of people who have connected with Bonhoeffer. It's like, oh, you like him too. You see the same things there. You're one of us. Or I'm, welcome. We recognize each other. And so that's been a great joy for me to meet these wonderful people I have from all over the world in various contexts, and how they've read Bonhoeffer in their context, and how we can read it here still.
Dr. Burnell, in your view, what was the most significant aspect of Bonhoeffer's life and legacy? Would you emphasize his political involvement, maybe his theological writings, or perhaps his preaching and pastoral work?
To me, Bonhoeffer is one of those people, I feel like I know him. I'm never going to meet him, of course. I know a few other people like this. I look at the total person. I look at the congruence, the consistency, the correlation between what they believe, what their values are, what's important, and what their passions are, and how they live out in life, how they live out their vision, they live out their dreams. I love the theology. It's very challenging to me. It led to much deeper and real changes, even in my own beliefs, my own values, my convictions of what to do with that. But I think I appreciate so much his honesty, his courage, and I just have a really respect for people like Bonhoeffer who knew what they believed in, what their values were, and they lived it out to fully. And that's a challenge to me to do the same in my own life.
So thank you very much for the interview. We have learned a lot of fascinating facts, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It was a joy.
Chciałbyśmy porozmawiać o urodzonym we Wrocławiu Dietrichu Bonhoefferze. Był on teologiem. Czym jest zatem teologia i kim jest teolog?
Trzeba tutaj powiedzieć o luterańskiej teologii. On był luterańskim teologiem, a luterańska teologia jest teologią krzyża. Według luterańskiej teologii, także Dietricha Bonhoeffera, ja nie mogę Boga zobaczyć twarzą w twarz, nie mogę mówić o Jego chwale, mogę Boga zobaczyć jak gdyby tylko od tyłu. Teologowie luterańscy powołują się na Mojżesza, który, jest taki tekst biblijny, widział Boga od tyłu, jakby plecy Boga. I luteranie powiadają, że żeby mówić o Bogu, trzeba patrzeć na Niego, trzeba patrzeć na krzyż. I właśnie szczytem teologii luterańskiej jest teologia krzyża. A zatem teolog jest tym, który dokonuje refleksji nad wydarzeniem krzyża. I wspomniałem właśnie o refleksji Marcina Lutra, która oczywiście była też bardzo bliska Bonhoefferowi, o tej takiej wymianie. Chrystus wziął nasze grzechy na siebie, by nam podarować swoją świętość. To jest jak gdyby taka suma luterańskiej teologii.
Kim jako myśliciel i teolog był Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Jakie były jego najważniejsze i najbardziej popularne idee?
To, o czym nawet wspomniałem na końcu, to było dla niego najważniejsze. Łaska droga i łaska tania. Łaska droga usprawiedliwia grzesznika, łaska tania usprawiedliwia grzech. Grzesznik, który doświadczył łaski drogiej, który został jako grzesznik usprawiedliwiony, powinien naśladować Jezusa, zwłaszcza kazanie na górze.
W Kościele, w teologii i w filozofii mówimy często o łasce. We współczesnym języku łaska jest raczej pojęciem o pejoratywnym znaczeniu. Mówi się czasami, że jest ktoś na łasce lub niełasce kogoś. Czym jest tania i kosztowna łaska w ujęciu Bonhoeffera? To jedna z najbardziej znanych myśli tego teologa i filozofa.
To prawda, łaska ma dzisiaj, ładnie to pani ujęła, pejoratywne znaczenie. Łaska wskazuje na pewną zależność od kogoś, a my nie lubimy zależności. My chcemy być wolnymi. My chcielibyśmy być wolnymi tak jak Pan. I takiej pokusie ulegli ludzie w raju i Bonhoeffer również w swojej teologii nad tym się pochyla. Gdy człowiek zechciał być jak Bóg, otworzył drogę do zła. Przez to zło weszło na świat. I teraz to zło zostało przezwyciężone na krzyżu. Bonhoeffer wykorzystuje tutaj pewną grę słów. Chrystus był Synem Bożym, który stał się człowiekiem. Adam odwrotnie był człowiekiem, który chciał stać się Bogiem. Chrystus, tak jakby druga przesłanka, został skazany na śmierć za to, że wobec Sanhedrynu wyznał: tak, ja nim jestem. Rozdarli szaty, słyszeli bluźnierstwo i skazali go na śmierć. I tu Bonhoeffer widzi paradoks. Ten, który jest prawdziwym Bogiem, został skazany za to, że uznał się, jakby był Bogiem. Nie? Czyli stanął w pozycji Adama, który myślał, że jest Bogiem. Skazujący Chrystusa myśleli, że On jest Bogiem, a On był rzeczywiście Bogiem. I dzięki temu mógł niejako zawrócić, choć nie powstrzymać tej historii zła, którą ościł na świat Adam przez to, że chciał być jak Bóg.
Kiedyś Karl Rahner, niemiecki teolog, mówił o anonimowych chrześcijanach. Anonimowy chrześcijanin to człowiek, który znając lub nie znając nauczania katolickiego, nie określa samego siebie na poziomie świadomym mianem chrześcijanina, choć pozostaje jakoś ukierunkowany na wiarę, nadzieję i miłość. Dietrich Bonhoeffer mówił o chrześcijaństwie bezreligijnym. Na czym polegało jego rozumienie chrześcijaństwa bezreligijnego? Czy Bonhoeffer myślał podobnie jak Rahner?
Powiedziałbym, że Bonhoeffer myślał inaczej niż Rahner, choć nawet w poważnych opracowaniach pisze się, że Bonhoeffer był prekursorem Rahnera. Ja postaram się w 3-4 zdaniach wyjaśnić, o co Rahnerowi chodziło. Otóż Rahnerowi chodziło o to, że nie będę używał trudnych terminów Rahnera, że Bóg jest otwarty na ludzi. Bóg posyła ludziom swoją łaskę. Człowiek natomiast jest otwarty na Boga i może tą łaskę Boga przyjąć, będąc nawet jej nieświadomy. I przez to, że przyjmuje łaskę, choć nawet jest tego nieświadomy, staje się anonimowym chrześcijaninem. Takie może niezbyt dobre porównanie. Rozmawiamy sobie tutaj, ale ile w tym kościele jest różnych fal radiowych z całego świata. I my jesteśmy niejako anonimowymi podmiotami tych fal. One są dla nas. Ale żeby je usłyszeć, trzeba by włączyć odbiornik radiowy. I tak do tego można porównać Rahnera. Bóg jak radio, Bóg jak rozgłośnia radiowa wysyła fale na cały świat. Człowiek to może przejąć, nawet nie włączając odbiornika, i przez to stanie się anonimowym chrześcijaninem. U Bonhoeffera trochę inaczej. On widział, że ludzie stają się bezreligijni, że praktycznie społeczeństwo już nie wierzy w Boga objawionego w Chrystusie i on się tylko zastanawiał, jak tym ludziom żyjącym w takim bezreligijnym świecie mówić o chrześcijaństwie. Mówi w sposób bezreligijny mówić o Chrystusie, w sposób bezreligijny mówić o Kościele. On tu niczego nie kwestionował, ale chciał znaleźć pewien sposób dotarcia do ludzi, którzy żyją w bezreligijnym świecie. On sam o tym pisze, że nie wyczerpał tego tematu. Rzucił tylko pewną ideę.
Czyli po prostu chrześcijaństwo bezreligijne było jego odpowiedzią na zmiany społeczne zachodzące.
Tak. Te zmiany szły w kierunku bezreligijności i właśnie on chciał tym bezreligijnym ludziom mówić o Chrystusie, o Kościele i tak dalej w sposób bezreligijny. Jakiś taki sposób chciał znaleźć.
Jak Bonhoeffer postrzegał rolę Kościoła we współczesnym świecie?
Rolą Kościoła jest przede wszystkim głoszenie Ewangelii. Ale to głoszenie Ewangelii wymaga też zaangażowania społecznego. Wymaga zaangażowania w krzewienie sprawiedliwości. Prosta rzecz, oddać każdemu to, co mu się należy, a odkąd świat nie było sprawiedliwości. Ludzie ciągle walczą o sprawiedliwość. Codziennie doświadczamy, że sprawiedliwości nie ma. Jakieś małe, większe niesprawiedliwości gdzieś nas tam dotykają. Bonhoeffer żył w czasach wielkiej niesprawiedliwości. Był nazik, który chciał wyeliminować jedną rasę szczególnie, ale także chciał wyeliminować innych. I w związku z tym Bonhoeffer zaangażował się w ruch przeciwko nazizmowi. Jak ktoś, powiedzmy, pędzi samochodem, żeby nie spowodował wypadku, nie zabił niewinnych, trzeba go zatrzymać, koniecznie, nie? I w przypadku tyrana on dopuszczał nawet myśl o zgładzeniu tyrana. Nawet do tego doszedł.
Na koniec chcemy zapytać, jak myśl Bonhoeffera może inspirować dzisiejszych chrześcijan w obliczu, tak jak ksiądz profesor powiedział, zła i niesprawiedliwości. Które z jego przesłań może być dziś najbardziej aktualne?
Ja myślę, właśnie to przesłanie, by działać na rzecz sprawiedliwości, pomimo iż wiemy, że tej sprawiedliwości nie będzie tu na ziemi. Pomimo, że już tyle razy ją nawet ogłaszano, ale jej po prostu nie ma. Co nas nie zwalnia z tego, żeby o tą sprawiedliwość zabiegać, żeby jednak w dzisiejszym świecie było jej więcej. Może to, co powiem, nie jest do końca w duchu Bonhoeffera, ale nas doprowadzi do Bonhoeffera. W ogóle wiemy, że jest sprawiedliwość, skoro jej tak często nie doświadczamy. Wiemy stąd, że przed upadkiem byliśmy w sprawiedliwym świecie i gdzieś tam w naszej naturze ta sprawiedliwość jest zapisana i że to jest tak ważny dla nas temat. I tutaj przejdziemy do tego, co było bliskie Bonhoefferowi. Jednak to był człowiek wierzący, nawet pod wpływem pietyzmu. Pietyzm inspirował go do naśladowania Chrystusa, ale to był także człowiek, który zabiegał o wiarę innych. Można o tym przeczytać. Był Bonhoeffer też duszpasterzem w samym Berlinie. Jak pracował z młodzieżą, która przygotowywała się do konfirmacji. To jest mniej więcej, nie powiem, tak dokładnie nie jest odpowiednik naszego bierzmowania, ale u luteran, zanim przyjmie się pierwszą komunię, a przyjmuje się ją w wieku od 14 do 16 lat, czy nawet później, to taki młody luteranin musi stanąć w swojej świątyni z innymi młodymi, nie? I wobec zboru świadomie wyznać wyznanie wiary. I Bonhoeffer do takiej konfirmacji przygotowywał młodych ludzi. Był też człowiekiem wierzącym. Mało tego, został pastorem, po to, by głosić Ewangelię. To było główne jego przesłanie, ale Ewangelia dotyka też o sprawiedliwości. pochyla się nad człowiekiem również i ten, który sprawiedliwości nie doznaje.